everyone, and welcome back in. This is episode 2 of our Sheridan project, and what an episode this is going to be. We are taking this from episode 1, which was the construction of our model, to episode 2, which is going to be the complete painting and weathering of the model. If that wasn't enough to grab your attention, I was contacted after the first episode by some viewers who had experience with the Sheridans, specifically Grant Mayberry and Paul Clayton. When we discussed the Sheridan in the first episode, we talked about the development and the requirement that the Sheridan, as a light tank, would be able to be airlifted or airdropped or parachuted into a battlefield situation. Paul Clayton, he provided me with a few photographs showing the Sheridan as they were being lashed down for air transport. These next couple of photographs I think are very interesting from Paul, and they show Paul's machine gun emplacement. That's his machine gun muzzle to the side of the screen as a Sheridan rumbles past. And then finally we see Paul standing guard in front of a Sheridan using a World War II era grease gun. This final photograph, this comes from Grant Mayberry, and he began his career on Sheridans as a driver and finished up as a gunner. He was also very instrumental in helping me along with the initial pre-stages, especially on the Sheridan project. This model is going to be based on Operation Just Cause, which related to the ouster of Daniel Noriega from Panama in December and January of 1989 through January of 1990. This also corresponds to a fairly interesting period in U.S. camouflage in that we were transitioning, we being the U.S., from the MERDC camouflages into the woodland or / NATO camouflage schemes. And what I enjoy so much about doing just a little bit of research on the backside just to get ready to do a project is that you can find these little unique, idiosyncrasies. And I happened across this one photograph, and it has the Summer Verdant MERDC, which is a sand-colored base, and then it has these splotches of green overall. And then what is common, of course, with all the MERDC are the squiggly black lines, and those are to represent branches or the shadows of branches and trees and things like that. Something just to break up the camouflage pattern a little bit. The thing to keep in mind is that it's hard to interpret camouflage patterns from a single photograph, and especially from vehicles that are in the field. There's a lot of dust and a lot of sun glare, and it's an old photograph. So in the end, I think it's a really cool camouflage pattern, and we're just going to roll with it, okay? Interpretations aside, I do end up with a camouflaged Sheridan model, and we'll let it spin around here for just a few seconds, just so you can kind of get an overall impression of how this looks before we begin the weathering. And not that I was feeling a little bit uncertain, but Echelon Decals also looked into the Operation Just Cause Sheridans, and right there on the top, here's this exact same vehicle, and their interpretation of the camouflage is close to what I came up with. So between the photograph and their references, this is what we've come up with. Okay, we've got the camouflage established, so let's move on to weathering. I begin with basically what's the panel lines and the pin washes, if you will. And those are, I decided this time, let's go ahead and do the weathering pencils just to establish, I guess, that base level of weathering throughout. If you've watched any of the previous videos, you'll see this. A little bit of moisture onto the surface, and then I can just draw exactly where I want the pencil or the color to be. Then I come back in with a clean brush with just a little bit of moisture on it, a little bit of water, and that will enable me to blend or dissolve or clean up any loose areas. And then if I want to do a little bit extra weathering, like streaks and things like that, just again, moisten the surface, add a few drops of paint, or in this case, pencil here and there, and then come back with a brush that's moistened a little bit, and I can blend and soften and smooth and diffuse any of these colors. Of course, this same process is used throughout, so what I did on the lower hull, I replicate on the upper hull, just basically going around all of the surface features and such. So again, this is kind of like the pin washing stage of the process, and it happens so quickly because these dried almost instantaneously. It's really great and allows you to move on. But if you've watched any of my projects, of course, what you know is that I love to use oil paints, and I have a handful of them here, and I have my palette ready to go. I've really begun to enjoy this combination of using the weathering pencils along with oil paints. What I like about using the pencils first is I can do all of this pin washing, establish a lot of the weathering kind of roadmap it out using the pencils. And then I can come back in over the pencils with, let's just call it maybe more nuanced effects using the oil paints. Now, of course, I don't need to worry about one or another affecting each other because the pencils, again, are water-based and the oils are thinner-based. And so in this application, I can go right back in over the top of the pencils without fear of disturbing them. And what I'm trying to kind of achieve here is a little bit of what Grant Mayberry's narrative was, which was the abuse the sun fade of the North Carolina skies and the sun had on these vehicles before deployment. I'm going to take a quick moment here. If you haven't done so already, I'd like to remind you to please hit that like and subscribe button. It does help a lot to get this channel to more and more folks out there in the world. If you like this channel and would like to see a little bit more content, well, please consider joining my Patreon. The link for that is in the description below. Over there, you'll find photographs of these projects as they're ongoing, final photographs, early viewing of these videos before they're released to the public, special interest videos, and a Discord server. So please consider joining. In terms of building, one of the last things we really need to do is take care of the stowage. And if you've done any little bit of research, you'll notice that the Sheridans have just all sorts of gear attached to their exteriors. Well, that's because, well, the Sheridan is a very small vehicle. And with this in mind, let me give a big thank you to Steve Munsell and Value Gear for their very kind contribution to this project. And as much as I love those Value Gear products, they just do not come pre-painted. I guess I have to do that myself. So I'm going to lay out some colors here on the palette. You know, you can add pops of color, so I'll add a little bit of browns here or reddish tones. And then we have the rucksacks with a little bit of woodland camouflage. And while we're speaking of details here, this is where everything starts to come together. Remember in the first episode where we scraped off all those molded on tie-down loops and replaced them with all those photo etch loops? Yeah, that took a lot of time. Now we can find the advantage of that because we can thread all these new straps through those loops and really make a very authentic tie-down. And yes, this all takes a lot of time, but sometimes just a few extra minutes or hours maybe is time well spent. Well, speaking of time spent, and I'm not sure this is time well spent, these Lincoln length tracks, I still have a struggle with those. Yes, they are painted and I'm doing a little bit of washes over the top of them, but they still don't have the sag that I want them to have. They just don't look natural. And so what I end up doing is giving them basically a wash of thin cement to soften them, put a bunch of different types of wedges and pliers and everything else in there, weights to get them to sag down to where I want them to. Then once that dries, then I can come back in and do the final weathering with a little bit of oil paint. Now we're on to the final touches. And you know, this driver, he's got a Coke habit. Excuse me, a Coca-Cola habit. These bottles and their decals are from Def Model. And really the final touches here have to do with the pigments. And on this particular model, it's going to be very, very limited. As my normal, I like to dilute my pigments or dissolve them, if you will, into some thinner so that's almost like a slurry or a paste. And then I can apply them very, very precisely using the brush. Once the pigments have dried, because again, I've applied them very, very specifically to certain areas, they are very much like what real dirt and earth are in our worlds. And so they can be stained and manipulated in much the same manner. Here on this model, like the fill caps and engine deck areas, and then I can use a little bit of oil paint just to kind of stain those pigments and make some very realistic dust and grime effects. Much like using the pencils and oils together, using oils and pigments together, it's all part of a learning process. This is why I love doing modeling, because it's all about experimenting and all trying to figure out the next thing to do in order to get what's in your head onto that model. Before we go any further, let me just extend a big thank you to both Grant Mayberry and Paul Clayton for their service and their contributions to this series. And so looking ahead, let's see. The next project is on the bench, And so videos of that will be coming soon. Let me just give the teaser that it's going to be kind of out of this world. We'll let you guess what that might look like. I do have some travel plans over the summer, so we'll talk about that as well and what schedules might look like. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. Take care, everybody. Happy modeling, and we'll talk to you soon.